Now, today we're going to go over lesson 2.4, solving quadratic equations. I'm going to just go to the lesson starting with number 1. Number 1 says, what is the quadratic term in the equation? All right, so we have the equation 10x squared minus 7 is 83. Is 83. Okay, well, remember, quadratic means that your highest degree is an x squared. Quadratic, whenever you're thinking about quadratic, you're gonna think of x squareds. Okay, if you have an equation like y equals x squared, this is a quadratic because the highest exponent on an x is 2. So this is degree 2. This is a function of degree 2. And the quadratic term here, to answer the question, is 10x squared. All right, remember that the negatives separate terms. So here there's one term, here's another term, and then here's the last term. So this equal sign would also separate terms as well. But in this case, this term is the answer. Number 2. For number 2, it says to solve the quadratic using the square root method. So we have 10x squared minus 7 is 83. Now, with the square root method, we have to isolate the x squared and then solve for the x using a square root. So we're going to do the inverse, basically solve the way you would solve it, right? Just by logic. We're going to isolate the 10x squared by getting rid of that negative 7. Move that 7 to the right, by canceling, doing the opposite. We have 10x squared equals 90. Then we have x squared. If we divide by 10, right? If we divide by 10, we're left with 9. Right? 10's cross out. And now if we square root both sides, right? The opposite of squaring is square rooting. We're going to square root both sides. And we're going to have x equals, don't forget the plus or minus. In front of every square root that you apply is a plus and minus. And the square root of 9 is 3 because 3 times 3 is 9. So when you type this in, it's a bit tricky because the answer says x equals plus or minus, and then you're supposed to put 3. That's all you're putting, 3. That is the answer. For number 3, speaking of number 3, it says to solve x plus 6 times x minus 3 equals 0. Solve for x using the ZPP. Well, oh my gosh, all these acronyms. Well, that stands for zero product property. ZPP is zero product property. What does that mean? It just means that we can get away with the easy way. We can get away with, just knowing that, hey, what if x plus 6 was 0? Well, then you would have this be 0, right? 0, and anything times 0 would give you 0. So that works, right? Because 0 times x minus 3 will give you 0. So that checks out. That means if x plus 6 was 0, then it works. But what would x have to be for x plus 6 to equal 0? Well, we move this. Do we really need parentheses? No. We don't, right? We don't have anything outside of the parentheses to be distributing, right? So we could just take those off, subtract the 6 from both sides to isolate the x. So you have x is negative 6. Now you can check that out, right? If you plug in a negative 6 for x, you get negative 6 plus 6 is 0, and then 0 times anything is 0. So that works. That checks out. Now, we can do the same thing for the x minus 3 term. If that was 0, then 0 times anything will give you 0. But let's find out what that x needs to be. Well, adding 3 to both sides, well, isolate your x, giving you x is 3, which if you plug in 3 for the x, you're going to have 3 minus 3 is 0. And 0 times anything is 0, so that works too. Perfect. Now we're on to number 4. Number 4 says, solve x times x plus 5 equals 0 for x using ZPP. Same thing. Hey, well, if this was 0, then 0 times anything will be 0, so that means x can be 0. And if this was 0, then it would also be 0, right? So if x plus 5 was 0, it would also work. So what would x need to be? Subtracting by 5 will isolate your x, giving you x is negative 5. Plugging negative 5 into there as a check gives you negative 5 plus 5 is 0, and 0 times anything is 0. So that also works. They both work. All right, number 5. Number 5 says to solve x squared plus 6x plus 8 is 0 by factoring. X squared plus 6x plus 8 is 0 by factoring. Well, if you remember our x method, if you multiply your a, right, your a and c values, again, this is in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c is your standard form equation. And up here, you're going to have your ac value, a times c. Down here, you're going to have your b value, right? So your AC value, your A right here is 1, right? Right here, you're going to have 1, because 1 times x squared is x squared. So therefore, your A is 1. Your A is 1 and your C, right? Your A is 1 and your C is 8. And 1 times 8 will give you 8. This is what it needs to multiply to. And your b value is your 6. This is what it needs to add to. So to factor this, we need to find two numbers that multiply to 8 and add to 6. So this could be 2 and 4. Because 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 plus 4 is 6. So we have x plus 2 and x plus 4 equals 0. That's how you make these into factors, right? So now it is factored. But we need to solve for x. But using the ZPP, we know that if x plus 2 was 0, then 0 times anything will give you 0. So x plus 2 needs to be 0 for this to be true. So you have x is negative 2. And the same thing applies here. If x plus 4 was 0, then 0 times x plus 2 would also be 0. So that would work. Let's find out what x is. Let's subtract by 4 on both sides to isolate the x. And if you plug those in, you'll see that these also work. All right, so we solve for x. Now, number 6, it wants us to graph using Desmos. Graph the following quadratic to identify the x-intercepts. So we're going to go to Desmos. Let me show you how to do that. We're going to go to Chrome. And then I'm going to go to Desmos, right? Let's say Desmos. Graphing calculator, sure. I'm going to hit it. Here I am. Then I'm going to plug in 7x squared minus 14x, 7x squared minus 14x. Minus 120. And let's see what it gives us. Go ahead and zoom out for us. Well, bam! Whoa, that is a big graph. But what you can see is that you're able to graph it, right? And you can see the x and y intercepts. Let's see if we put our little pointer there. Oh, we could see that one x value is negative 3.26. That's interesting. I graphed this wrong. We went 7x squared minus 14x minus 120. And then the other point is at 5.25. That is interesting. Okay. Well, let me just tell you the answer that Desmos gives. Honestly, 7x squared minus 14x minus 120. Maybe they meant to put 12. Let's see if we put 12, what do we get? If we put 12, we're close. Right? 2.6. They got a 2.9. Maybe they meant to put 20. Wow, I can't believe I got it. 2.96. All right. So Canvas messed up his little typo here. They meant to make the equation minus 20 instead of minus 120. So it's a little typo there. I'll go ahead and fix that for you guys. Now, here is number 7 wants you to input. Oh, this one's a bit tricky. So let me go back to here for number 7. Number 7 says 3x squared plus